Give it another minute or so. All right, we are at 7 p.m., so we can go ahead and get started.
Great.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Annie Tillman. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator here at the Schaumburg Library. And tonight we have a special guest with us. We've got Ed Janka, and we're going to explore the voting process for election 2020, especially in the midst of a global pandemic. Tonight, we'll discuss the challenges to assessing the ballot across the country, as well as a discussion of the process in Illinois with a special focus on mail-in ballots. So Ed is the Director of Communications and Public Policy for the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois. Appointed to the post of Director of Communications in June of 1999, Janka is the primary spokesperson for the most prominent civil rights and civil liberties advocacy organization in the state of Illinois, an organization with more than 70,000 members and supporters. On behalf of the ACLU of Illinois, Janka appears regularly on television and radio programs in Illinois and throughout the nation to speak on a myriad of issues. Janka is also widely cited in newspapers and publications on legal and legislative matters closely related to the ACLU of Illinois priorities. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ed.
Great. Thank you, Annie. And it's so nice to be here. I only wish that we were all together this evening talking about these issues, frankly, because it'd be great to be together with people in any setting right now. We are, as all of you know, in the midst of voting right now. In fact, the voting season is well underway, both here in Illinois and across the country. And it really is, in many ways, the purest way in which we express our views about the kinds of policies that we want. The kinds of policies that we want at the federal level, but also the kinds of policies that we want at the state level and even down to the local level, even down to what we want from our local library. Voting is a reflection of who we are and what we desire and what we want. And frankly, it's our way of demanding and petitioning from government to get those very things. So voting has really always been key and critical to our nation's history. And that history is really about looking to expand access to the voting booth. From the time of our formation, obviously, as a country, our voting and the notion of who got included in voting was very, very slim and very small as compared to the population of folks who were here. And obviously, as many of you know, we just recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. But even that was limited in that though women got the right to vote, it was mainly white women who got access to the ballot while others were still left behind. Of course, in the 1960s, in 1965, Congress passed and the president signed the Voting Rights Act, which became in many ways the most singularly successful piece of civil rights legislation in the history of the United States. In fact, you can virtually draw a straight line in terms of voter participation for people across a number of demographic groups from the enactment of the Voting Rights Act up until the 2008 and 2012 elections. our demographics as a country began to change, and so did who voted and who got to vote. And what we saw through the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act was that people were given access to the ballot. Now, in 2013, and this will become relevant for what we're facing today in terms of access to the vote in the 2020 election, in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act in a case called Shelby County versus Holder. And in that case, a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 5 was the definition of which jurisdictions were required under the Voting Rights Act to get pre-clearance before they could change any kind of practice in their voting jurisdiction. So voting jurisdictions, as defined by the Voting Rights Act, that it had a history of discriminating against people of color having access to the ballot, were forced to go to Washington and ask either the Justice Department or a federal court in Washington for permission before they made any changes to their voting system. And by the way, this could be as small as moving a precinct from one location to another. These were very, very, very small changes that were now needed to get that pre-clearance. And so what we saw again over that time was the expansion of access to the vote. After the 2013 decision in Shelby County, what we saw was a series of measures taken in jurisdictions that had been previously covered that now allowed for precluding people from voting, shifting polling locations far away, or combining polling locations, say on college campuses. You saw voter rolls being struck at a fairly alarming rate for people who only voted, say, every 4 years in a presidential election, so that when they went back for a presidential election, we saw, people would come and discover that they were no longer registered. So the idea of cutting back on access to voting is something that we've really been confronted with for the last several years. And one of the ways in our view that we've really seen this most significantly is through the adoption of so-called voter ID laws, which have an unusual twist to many of them. For example, in both Wisconsin and in Texas, you can vote with the state issue ID that you need in order to buy a gun, but you cannot vote with the state issued ID that lets you go to their major flagship university. And so, all of this reaches a zenith in advance of the 2016 election, when in North Carolina, they adopt in the legislature there a series of measures that are, quote, voter reforms that it turns out ultimately a federal court finds ended up with almost surgical precision, limiting access to the ballot, mostly for people of color, but also for some people who were elderly. And those were steps that were taken to do things like to limit early voting hours, or to change certain kinds of provisions, or to require certain kinds of identification cards, all of which had this impact of really substantially limiting a number of different votes in the state of North Carolina. So all of this activity that's happening that I described all happens before we get to 2020 and COVID. And so what do we do to be safe? How do we ensure that people don't have to make a choice between voting safely and being able to express their will? And there's been some really amazing things, I have to say, even in this moment. There's been some really amazing outpourings. Today, I don't know if any of you saw the news, but just today, early voting began in the state of Georgia. And there were people who waited in line for 5 hours in order to vote, keeping socially distanced, many of them wearing masks, many of them protecting themselves in a variety of different ways. And so, we see that people have adapted. But one of the things that many have thought about in states across the country are trying to wrestle with is how do they change their laws in order to allow people greater access to vote by mail? Vote by mail is a process, as many of you know, that has been around in the United States ever since the Civil War, ever since the election of 1864, the election that reelected Abraham Lincoln. And the reality is that this is a process that has been created and perfected over the years, so it's safe and secure. In fact, over the last several years, a number of states have moved to virtually entirely voting by mail or voting remotely in those ways. States like Colorado and Washington State conduct their elections almost entirely by mail-in ballot. So the reality is that these are systems that we know how to use and that we know how to make secure and that we know how to make safe, most important, for this particular election. And, in many ways and in many places, there has been this kind of contentiousness or suspicion about the use of mail-in ballots, which has caused many jurisdictions to try to put in place prohibitions against the use of the ballot or other restrictions. And so groups, including the ACLU, are in court in about 25 states across the country with an eye towards assuring that people get the opportunity to cast a mail-in ballot as opposed to having to go and risk their health in public. And there's by in-person voting. And there's a variety of different methods by which, these efforts have been made to limit in-person vote or vote by mail around the country. One of the measures that probably many of you have heard of is that in some states, there's a requirement for a witness signature or even a notarized signature that you are the person signing the ballot. And obviously for someone who lives alone or someone who may be stricken with COVID or someone who may be concerned about having others into your home, that just creates a burden that many will not be able to overcome in order to cast their ballot in this election. The other thing that I think we often see is, efforts to limit who can vote by mail in unnecessary ways, that you have to fill out again an affidavit saying that you're going to be out of the state or out of the country in order to be able to access that. And in a time again of COVID, that doesn't make sense. There's also litigation going on that has to do with how soon after the election mail-in ballots have to be received by the election authority, even if they're postmarked by election day. So all of these issues are playing out in many states. In Illinois, the legislature came together in the spring. And while the legislature was not really able to have its full session in the way that it normally would, they did anticipate the need for November to address a lot of concerns that people had about voting. And I think you can understand why in Illinois this became even more important, given the fact that, our primary in March literally kind of hit just as the stay-at-home orders and other kinds of restrictions that most of us are now living with, really began to be put in place, that we really were dealing with the kind of issues about being able to be out there and be out in public or be with crowds or be with gatherings. And just as those began to be put in place, we really saw, was right in the midst of the primary. And so there was a really, I think, an understanding of the need to, put in place some measures that would help people in Illinois vote. So what did the legislature do? Well, they took a number of steps that we're now seeing play out in this election. And thus far, by all reports, this process is going pretty well. and people are voting. They're voting in significant numbers. They're requesting ballots in significant numbers, but it does seem to be working well. But the first thing that the legislature did was that they actually designated Election Day of November 3rd, 2020 as a holiday. And I should say that all of the changes I'm about to describe are actually all in place only for the 2020 election. The notion being that they want to look at how this works. They want to look at the way in which these processes then work, and they'll make a decision about whether or not to extend them to future elections here in the state of Illinois. So as I say, November 3rd will now be a holiday. Here's why that matters. In a typical election day, especially a presidential election day in the state of Illinois, there are essentially two periods of time when the polling places are busy. They're busy early in the morning from the time they open at 6 until roughly 8 a.m., and then they begin to clear off. And they're busy essentially from 5 p.m. until the polls close at 7. And the reason is very clear. Because people have to go to work, because people are busy, because people, are trying to get their vote cast, and they want to make sure they do. So they're doing it in that time that really is allotted to them. So the notion here is by making Election Day a state holiday for as many people who are able to get that holiday, will allow people to go at a time when they can anticipate that the polls will be less crowded, where there'll be fewer people and they'll be exposed to less opportunity to catch coronavirus or to be mingling with other people. So that's one thing that the state of Illinois did. The second thing that they did was they greatly expanded vote by mail. And I suspect by this time, many of you who are listening to this already know that this is true, because among the things that the legislature did was to create a mandate so that every election authority across the state of Illinois had to make mail-in ballots available to voters who vote regularly. That is, to voters who voted in the last two presidential elections, or in the primary and the last presidential election, or in 3 consecutive elections. If you were someone who was a regular voter in this instance, you got back in September an application to vote by mail, which you could fill out, send in, and the election authority will send your ballot to you. But the other part of that was, of course, that knowing that a lot of people, and by the way, you'll get if you didn't respond to that particular invitation, you'll get a secondary invitation asking you if you want a vote by mail ballot, which again, you can fill out and submit and get that ballot back. The second thing that they did was they created a universal application for a vote by mail ballot through the State Board of Elections. This is really critical because, of course, oftentimes people aren't quite sure exactly which election authority to go to. I think there are 106 or 105 election authorities in the state of Illinois. So people often aren't sure where their registration is at, what they should do. And so they created this universal form. It also took a burden off of, many of the smaller counties who might not have the resources to build out that kind of application online, and therefore made it easier for voters in those locations to be able to get that vote by mail ballot as well. The next thing that the law did was it said that the vote by mail ballots, as they're returned, must be honored through the post office, even and accepted by voting authorities, even if they don't have postage on them. Again, it seems like a small thing probably for many of us, But the idea of getting postage, of having the right postage to submit a ballot and return it is a pretty high bar for some people right now. Maybe people who aren't going out at all, or who continue to be concerned because of illness in their family. And so the notion of having that kind of access just simply to postal materials, forgive me, can be complicated. And so the legislature just said that in that case, the election authority should accept those ballots, pay for them if need be, and allow them to move through the system in the same way. And finally, and this was something that was part of the system that was put in place in the spring, even before a lot of the recent publicity and problems at the U.S. Postal Service, which is that the legislation allows for election authorities to create drop boxes, central locations where you don't have to rely on the mail, you don't have to worry about your ballot getting lost, but you can actually just go and drop it off physically yourself. The election authority gets those straight out of that drop box and can begin the processing of those ballots, for themselves in that instance. The next thing that the legislation mandates is a process, generally speaking, although each election authority will vary in some ways on this, but a process for dealing with the ballots. As you know, as many of you will know, when you get a mail-in ballot, you sign that ballot, you have your signature on there, you date it. One of the things that the legislation permits or mandates is that each election authority sets up a panel or multiple panels of 3 election judges, bipartisan in nature, who review the signatures and compare the signatures on incoming ballots. If and only if all 3 judges conclude that it is not the same signature as on the ballot or on the mail-in ballot as is recorded in the record book, that ballot is now processed and counted. And it also allows election authorities to begin processing those ballots, mail-in ballots, prior to election night or prior to election day. So what will happen is that as these ballots begin to come in greater numbers, the ballots will be checked to make sure that it's the appropriate person who's voting with them. They'll be opened. They'll be fed into a reader so that the vote is actually recorded, but the vote will not be tabulated or reported until the polls close on November 3rd at 7 p.m. So much like the early voting counts that you see in elections past, where instantly, at 7:02 or 7:04, you have all of this massive vote that's actually come in. You're going to see that vote increase because it's going to be not just the early vote, but it's going to be this vote by mail batch that comes in as well. Again, there's nothing frightening about the vote by mail process. If you are careful, if you follow the instructions, if you sign the ballot on the outside in your name, if you use a black or a blue pen to do so and submit it, you're not going to have any problem. The one last thing that I think has been really great during this cycle as well is that most election authorities have expanded tracking of the ballot so that when you apply, when the election authority receives your application, when they mail you the ballot, when they have it returned, and when it has been received in process, you'll be able to track that all the way through, which is something which I think will give people a great amount of comfort to ensure that their vote is cast. In terms of in-person voting for the election, then, the law did a number of different things. It expanded and extended the time and the hours of early voting across the state of Illinois and created in most jurisdictions these so-called super sites that are sort of universal sites where you can go and early vote without regard to you being in your precinct or exactly in the polling place that you would go on election day. Those universal sites will remain open through election day. So again, if you find yourself somewhere on election day, you're not certain as to exactly where your voting place is, but you know about the universal site, you can just go there, no matter where your precinct is, you'll be given a ballot and you will be allowed to vote. And I should just add here, because it's something we've had for a few cycles in Illinois, but it's really critical, is that you can register right up until and on election day in the state of Illinois. You can show up at one of those universal sites if you don't know, again, where your precinct is. You can walk in, have the appropriate ID, you can register to vote, and you can vote right there. The other thing that election authorities are allowed to create for this process in 2020 is so-called curbside voting. For people who are concerned, again, who want to go and cast that ballot in person, but they're concerned about COVID, they're concerned about walking into a location, jurisdictions will be creating curbside voting that allows voters to drive up, to get a ballot, to fill the ballot out, and to return it right then and there on election day. That's something that voters have used in other states. It seems to work well in those states. And again, we've actually had curbside voting for many, many years in Illinois for people with disabilities. And so therefore, this is just an expansion of that process that's already worked. The next thing is, in terms of early voting, is that the state now has a mandate for election authorities that each and every one of the sites that they're using for voting, either early voting or in-person voting on election day, needs to be consistent with CDC recommendations for dealing with COVID. So what you're seeing here is that, for example, the super sites and other kinds of polling places for election day are, as a general proposition, are being set up in a way that you have distance between you and the person voting next to you. When you're presenting when you're signing or asking for your ballot, there is, again, some social distancing that takes place. Machines are cleaned after each use. There's a provision in place, in some places that they may have to actually move a polling place, but only because it gives them access to a little bigger space that allows them to have people be socially distanced. Lines are not going to be as cramped. There's going to be, people helping to keep folks distance in those lines, so that where those exist, there's an opportunity for people to be safe. And I think to give that feeling of security in responding to this epidemic, pandemic, forgive me, but feeling like they can, in fact, go to the polling place if they want and be able to vote. And the last thing that I think is really interesting and frankly just a great idea is that the state law allows for young people who are 16 and 17 years old, not yet eligible to vote. It allows them, if they want to go through the training, to become election judges. One of the realities is that we know that people who have been election judges in Illinois and across the country in the past have largely been people who are retired, who are older, who many of whom have done this for years and years in terms of helping out with polling. This gives an opportunity for younger people who might feel healthier, safer, are able to take all of the precautions of being there, to a chance to participate in the system. But I think more importantly is it allows them to become a part of this system early on. And, one would hope not only to become judges for a long time to come, but actually become voters for a long time to come. And that's something that, I think we see as being very, very important. Let me just address one question, because it's the question that we're hearing the most often as we go through this particular election process thus far, which is that a lot of voters ask the question, I filled in the application as soon as it came. I have a mail-in ballot, but boy, oh boy, I miss voting in person. What can I do? Can I change my mind effectively? I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to vote twice. I don't want to do any of those things. But how do I do this? And it turns out that this is really very simple. If you have a mail-in ballot and you want to change your mind, change your mind. All you have to do is take that ballot with you and go to your either an early voting site, the universal site, your polling place on election day, and surrender that ballot. When you surrender that ballot, that will be recorded. You'll be given a in-person ballot. You'll be able to vote it, and you'll know that your vote is recorded right then and there. If for some reason you decide that you want to do this and you've received the in-person or the mail-in ballot, but you just can't find it, or you just don't know where that is. Well, that's again very simple. You go to the polling place, you explain what happened. The election officials will do a couple of different things. There's two possible approaches depending on exactly your circumstance. You'll either be asked to sign an affidavit saying that, say, the ballot never arrived. If you sign that affidavit, you should be given a ballot and again be able to cast that ballot and not have any further questions. If you say, I just can't find it, or it's there, or I've got it at home, but I didn't do anything with it, you'll be asked to vote a provisional ballot. But if you find the ballot, you can bring it back, and that will then automatically shift or move that provisional ballot from being a provisional ballot to being a live ballot that is captured and counted. If, and this is the last little trick of this, if you vote a provisional ballot in that circumstance, 2 weeks after the election, when everybody is assured that your ballot has not showed up in the mail after that, you haven't been, tried to vote twice, in point of fact, that provisional ballot will then be counted and included in the final count. So that is that question about whether or not you can change has been one we've been hearing a lot, and absolutely you can, and you shouldn't hesitate if suddenly you think that process of voting is just better for you than doing a mail-in ballot. You shouldn't worry about that. You should go ahead and do it. Let me just close by saying a couple of things. There are some important deadlines that are still in front of us here in this election season. October 18th is the last day. That's October 18th is the last day to register to vote online. Again, you can still register in person up to and including Election Day, but you can register online through the 18th of October. October 29th is the last day to request a mail-in ballot. I again would urge you, if you're thinking about voting by mail, to make that ask even earlier, but the deadline for doing that is on the 29th of October. And then, of course, just on Election Day, November 3rd, is the day that you need that mail-in ballot to be postmarked. If in fact, if in fact you're going to submit that mail or that ballot through the mail. Although, again, on Election Day or that late, these drop boxes in your local area may be a good option for you in terms of doing that. That's a lot of information packed into about 30 minutes. I want to encourage you, if you have anything where you feel like you need something you want to read, if you absorb information better that way, you can go to our website at www.aclu-il.org. And you can find right at the top of the website is a banner that says "Let People Vote," and you can click on that, and it will take you to all of this information that I've described for you, and much, much more in terms of the exact pieces of information you need to register, and all of those materials, and all of that matters. The last thing I just want to say is, this is a really critical, as we talked about in the beginning, this is a really critical way to express your views, no matter who you support for which office. And you should not hesitate for a moment to participate in this system, because A, you have to think about your health, there are options, or B, because you just, you don't think that your vote counts. It does. It turns out that voting always counts, that a small amount of votes often make a difference in the biggest and smallest of races. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is just the admonition: make a plan to vote. It turns out that if you simply make a plan and articulate it, you are much more likely to vote. So here's the thing: share that with family and friends. Let them know what you're going to do, and maybe they'll do the same thing, or maybe it'll at least make them think about making their own plan. And finally, I would just say that, the last thing is, of course, that in this season of all seasons, we're going to have to be patient with these results. We may not know on November 3rd at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 p.m. Central Time, who the next president of the United States is, or who the next senator is from our state or any others. But one of the things I think we can depend upon is that the important message that we want is that every vote should be counted. And so, I would just urge people, not to give in to the passions of, where that process is, but to let that process play out in terms of counting every vote before we get to results. It may not seem like the old days, as I say, but on the other hand, better to be right in the end than to have some quick result that in the end is not, or that doesn't really reflect the will of the majority of all voters in our state or in our district or in our country. And so that's really something I think that we can all keep in mind for 2020. So Annie, I think with that, I'm ready to answer any questions you might have.
Fantastic. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A box. We'll gladly accept them in either place. So if you've got those, I know it sometimes takes a minute to type them out. If you do, you answered most of the ones that I had, which is great. So thank you for covering such a wide berth of information. I've got one that I can ask while we're waiting to see if we've got any more. I was curious about people that are in hospitals. If they are in a hospital, how do they manage voting with a mail-in ballot or something like that?
Sure. So there is a let me stop. The law allows for someone to assist you if you need any kind of assistance in terms of voting. And the hospital, I think, is probably the best sort of example of that. You can seek the assistance of someone else to help you fill out the ballot, to help you ensure that it's returned, to help do a number of those kinds of things. There is actually a form on the mail-in ballot where you can sort of indicate who that person was, and they sign it along with your signature, to demonstrate that they helped you, but that you were cognizant of the fact that they were, and it was part of a process in terms of doing that. That's really an incredibly important thing, and something that I think is very important that folks know that they can get that help in much the same way that, if you go and vote in person, if you need help in the voting booth, if you just need someone to go and make sure that you're doing what you want to, or help in reading the ballot itself, or any of those sorts of things, any physical limitations that one might have, all of those things are things that you can do live in-person voting, and of course you can make sure that you can also do it through a mail-in ballot. So that is completely permissible.
Awesome. Got another one. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but with so many people doing mail-in ballots and it needing to be postmarked by election day, when can we expect election results, if not that night?
So, and Annie, I don't mean to try to upstage you here, but I'm going to make a little plug. We're just about to drop an episode of our podcast called Talking Liberties with the ACLU of Illinois that we recorded late last Friday, where we talked to the spokesperson for the Illinois State Board of Elections. And I thought his view, because I asked him the same question.
Yeah.
And I thought his answer was really great, which was essentially, we'll know a lot within a day or so, but in tight races, it may take 5 or 6 or 7 days to have full results. And it may even take some time after that. But, this is where I go back to, better we get the results right and we know, as opposed to, rushing to something that in the end doesn't end up being, what the will of the people actually reflects. But I think in Illinois, we'll know a lot about some of the big races, if not the night of the 3rd, then by the next day, because, you'll start to get all of the mail-in ballots in as part of that process with the early vote. But there could be some very close races that could take us a little while before anyone is able to call them.
Awesome. We had a question last week in a different program about gerrymandering and what we can do to kind of help with that or help prevent it moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and as some of your watchers may know here, and audience may know here, the Supreme Court of the United States has now said that gerrymandering is, and political gerrymandering is a political question, which is not one that the courts will take up anymore. And so therefore it's critical, to the extent that, we're going to do anything about gerrymandering, that it's going to have to be done through the legislative process. So there's a couple of things that I would say that people could do who are concerned about this. And let me say, the one probably most important thing that people can do is to make sure they complete the census. Because obviously, if we have an accurate representation of population, it makes that process, it begins that process from a much better baseline. So, I think that's a really critically important thing. But then the other piece is just to make clear to elected officials, that you view, fair lines drawn in ways that reflect, the population, that try to be as contiguous as possible, that attempt to put communities in the same legislative or certainly congressional districts. I think is just reflecting that out and saying that that's what you anticipate and want, is the other thing that you can, that one can do. We don't have an independent commission process here in Illinois. I don't think we're likely to get one, certainly in time for the redistricting that takes place after this census. And so I think, again, if you're, there are groups of people who are, doing that work and trying to work towards a fair map system as they define it. And, you could think about joining and supporting them as well. But I think it's really about making your voice heard during that redistricting process itself.
Excellent. I know we had a question from a staff member earlier about the signature on the envelope. They wanted to make sure that they were getting that right because their signature has changed over the last couple of years.
So this is actually one of the, I think, another one of the things that, you know, that electoral authorities across the state are really doing, that's helpful. And so this is why, if you have a mail-in ballot, get it in early. Because here's you know, I think that process, if your signature has changed, if something happens, if you're trying to do it in the car on the way to work or on the way to the grocery store and you get that wrong, you'll be notified if there's a problem with your signature. And if you get that notice, then you will be able to, you know, through a variety, depending on the circumstance, and I don't want to speculate on what it might be, but for example, you could go to the electoral authority, again, on an off hour when you wouldn't run into people, if that's what you were concerned about, and you can demonstrate to them that that is your signature and you are who you are. So there are a number of different processes in place for those kinds of things that allow you to cure your ballot, any kind of ballot problem that you may have prior to election day, so that you make sure that your ballot is actually counted. I think that probably everybody, and this may be a part of the question as well, I think everybody saw there was an NPR national report about the primaries and the fact that mail-in ballots were rejected at a higher rate than other ballots around the country. If you are cautious and careful, if you follow the instructions and the ballot comes with a very clear set of instructions and you sign that, you know, I think that people aren't going to have a problem with their ballot being rejected. And most importantly, as I say, you're going to get that opportunity to cure the ballot if in fact that's what, you know, if in fact there's any problem for you. So that again speaks to this idea of getting the ballot in early, tracking it, making sure you're looking for it so that and you'll be notified within, I think it's 24 hours, if your ballot is there's a problem identified in terms of the signature. And again, it'll give you a variety, the election authority will give you a variety of different means by which you can make sure that that gets corrected.
Excellent. I think that might be it for questions, but I wanted to encourage people to get out there and vote, or bring it home and do it from the comfort of your own home so that you can do it safely. I know I've got my mail-in ballot all ready to go to drop off. And anecdotally, it was a really easy process. Just made sure that I was registered to vote, then followed along with the process. I got an email every step of the way as I got it. So,
and you know, really, if you think about it, Annie, in many ways, you know, that ability to be at home when you do that makes it easier in terms, like, you know, looking at the judicial races and finding a source that you trust in terms of judicial evaluations and things of that nature. Whereas, you know, I don't know, some of us got a little embarrassed over the years taking the cheat sheet into the polling place with us, although we did it. You know, but this gives you that real opportunity to, you know, sort of think about that, to evaluate sources, to really know what you want to do, you know, when you walk in there.
Definitely. And I'll be sharing, we're going to be sharing another video soon that has nonpartisan resources that you can use to kind of make sure that you understand what you're voting for and who you're voting for and how you're doing it. So please keep an eye out for that on schaumburglibrary.tv. Thank you so much, Ed. This was really wonderful information and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Annie. It was great to be with you this evening.
Likewise.